Hey everybody, welcome back. In this screencast, I'm going to talk about media queries and the idea of responsive design. Before I do that though, I had a request to have my dog, I actually have two dogs, be in the video. So there's one, Agnes. Oh, now she's gone. Come up here. That's Agnes. Winnie is probably on the couch behind me sleeping. Anyway, so media queries. So when building websites, obviously at this point in time when over half of users are now accessing websites using a mobile device or a tablet as opposed to just a regular desktop computer, it's really important as a web designer and a developer to make sure that you're thinking about what that experience is going to be like for someone on a smaller device. So this is called responsive design. There's also a term called mobile first. So a lot of designers will design for mobile first and then figure out what the design will look like on a wider screen like a tablet, and then on a more traditional desktop or laptop screen. So let's look at this example of the WCC website, the new WCC website. So I am on my laptop right now. This is what it looks like when looking and on a wider screen, you know, like over 1,000 pixels wide. And I'm just going to make the screen a little narrower using my cursor. And you can see everything's getting a little smaller. Let me go back out. So not just the boxes, but if we look at like these titles right here, future students, business and industry, those are all getting slightly smaller. And the pictures are getting smaller as we get narrower. And of course, you can see here, community is starting to go outside the box, so that's a little rough. But then all of a sudden, we get to a certain width and everything changes. So it goes to a more stacked or one column layout. So all the same content is there, which means all the HTML, all the content and all the tags around the content is the same. But what has changed is the CSS being applied to each of these elements. So again, you can just simply manipulate the width of the browser window to see what that looks like. Here's another example. This is the Ann Arbor Art Center, a very straightforward site. We've got a bunch of stuff in the header here, horizontal navigation, big header or hero image, and then little 4-column boxes down there. So same thing, as I get lower, or narrower I should say, everything's changing in size. These images got smaller. And then this is a little different. It goes from these 4 columns down here went from 4 to 2. And I think as I get even smaller, more toward mobile, a mobile size, actually I can't make this any smaller, but I'll show you in the next tool. Eventually on mobile, these switch from 2 column to 1 column. So all of that is enabled through the use of these things called media queries. So this is a CSS specific thing called media queries. And I'm going to show you a quick example of what these media queries are and what you can do with them. So let me switch over to my code. In this screencast, I'm not going to actually type out the code. I'm just going to sort of walk through what's already there, and I will link to this example in the YouTube link. So if we just look at the HTML to begin with, I've got, standard stuff. I've got an H1, some paragraphs, and I've got a 2-column thing happening down here. I've got a container div with 2 nested divs inside. And if we go look up at my CSS, so there's some media queries in here, but basically this right here is targeting those 2 nested divs. You can see I have float, so they're floating, so they're next to each other, and I've given them a width. Okay, so that's what we're looking at right here. So at this wide width, we've got 2 divs sitting next to each other. And also the other thing is the background color is this kind of ugly tan color. So what I've done in the CSS is I've added some media queries to basically tell it to apply different CSS properties when certain conditions are met. So when using media queries, the basic idea is that you're saying, and let's start with the first thing here. So I've got some media queries up at the top here that are going to change the background color of the page at different device widths. So a media query, first of all, always starts like this, little @media. So that's, we're basically saying we are defining a media query. All media queries define a set of conditions. Those conditions can be the type of device. Is it a screen? Is it print? It can be the device width, and you can be specific with pixel values or more relative units. The orientation of the screen, so this is more applicable to tablets and mobile, so landscape or portrait. And I believe some of the other conditions are related to screen resolution. Is it like a retina screen or not? And there might be a couple other, but the main conditions you're typically going to be targeting are device width, so how wide is the screen, and potentially orientation, is it landscape or is it portrait? So using the media query, you say I'm creating a media query using @media. In this situation, I'm saying when the condition is it's a screen accessing this page, not a printer, and when the maximum width of the screen that is currently accessing this web page, when the maximum width is 992 pixels. So if it's 993 pixels, this condition will not apply. But if it's 992 pixels or less, then these conditions are true. Therefore, apply whatever CSS rules I've put in between the media query brackets. So the media query defines a set of conditions. If those conditions are true, apply whatever CSS rules you have placed in between the brackets. So this could be any number of CSS rules that you put in there. I've just put one. I've said if the screen width is 992 pixels or less, change the background color of the body tag, so the entire browser window, to teal. I've said another media query that says when the screen width is 600 pixels or less, set the background color to olive. So basically these three sections here work together. So you notice that the very first one, whoops, I think I cut out there for a second. So these three work together. Notice that the very first one up here is not surrounded by a media query. So I'm just saying, by default, set the background color to tan. And then I'm saying, or if the screen is this size or less, set it to this. The next one says, or if it's this size or less, set it to this. Okay, so to see that in action, I'm going to go ahead and change the width of my browser window. And you can see, obviously at this point, it has hit 992 or less. It changes to teal. I keep going until it hits 600 or less, changes to olive. So that's basically how media queries work. You just integrate it with your CSS and you say, you set a default style, and then you say, or if there's this condition, if the device width is such that it's probably a tablet view, then apply these rules. Or if it's such that it's a mobile view, then apply these rules. And you don't always have to do exactly those, exactly three widths: desktop, tablet, mobile. That is a common approach, but it really just depends on what design you're starting with and what content you have in there, and just ultimately what it looks like in those different devices. To help you figure out what it looks like in those different devices, there are a couple tools that I use. There are many tools, but a couple I want to share with you. First one, of course, is the inspector tool. I'm going to pull up the inspector tool, and the inspector tool in Chrome, that's what I'm using, looks like this. There's this little icon of like a tablet and a mobile phone. If you click that, it basically shows you, or basically takes you to a responsive view. And these options up here are really helpful. So when I open the drop down, it has these default sizes already in here for the common or currently available iPhones, iPads, and then the Pixel and Galaxy, the other common phones that are out there. Of course, this is not comprehensive. These are just sort of the more popular or common ones. So it gives you a sense of what your page, what your site is going to look like, for example, on an iPhone or on an iPad. You can also switch the orientation, and obviously in switching the orientation, so you can see here iPad landscape is 1024 width by 768 height. Switch that to portrait, and of course the width goes from 1024 to 768. Anyway, so there's, this is part of the testing process. You design, and then you build, and you test, and then you tweak and test and tweak and test. So I find this tool to be really helpful. I use it constantly. So again, there are these presets, or you can just go into responsive mode, and you can actually just sort of manipulate the width and the height as needed to see what your page looks like. So that's one tool. Another one that I found helpful and free, there are a lot of non-free tools out there as well, but this thing is called responsinator.com, and you can basically just type in your site. This isn't going to work for a site that you only have on your computer that's local. You need to publish it somewhere where it's publicly available. You hit go, and then it just shows you, for example, on an iPhone X, this is what your page is going to look like. Scroll down on an iPhone X landscape, Android, portrait. So it's got a bunch of, again, popular options. Here's an iPad to give you a sense of what your page is going to look like on those particular devices. Yeah, so that's basically it. I guess the other thing in this example, I do have, I think I have it in here. Yeah, so I also have these two boxes that are, on a wide view floating next to each other. I've added a media query to target, so the background color, of course, is changing. And then I added a media query here that changes these boxes to not float and to have a width of 100%. So they basically go from two columns sitting next to each other, each taking up half the space, to stacked, or one column, each taking up 100% of the space. So if we look at this media query, it's just right here. When it's a screen and the max width is 767, so this is my semi-arbitrary breakpoint. Breakpoint meaning when I want this switch to happen. Target each box, which has a class name called column, set the width to 100, change the padding, set the float to none. I don't want them to sit next to each other anymore. I want them to sit on top of each other, which is their normal block level state. And then I have an additional rule here too that is only applying to the first box. So the column here, that is the first child of this container. I'm just giving it a slightly different margin. Okay, so that's about it. Oh, I forget, I have this one example here. This is just, fewer sites have this now, but if you don't code responsively, or if you don't use media queries within your CSS, or or at least if you're not using, relative sizing, then what you run the risk of is having your site do something like this. So as I make it narrower to emulate what it might look like on a tablet or a phone, you can see content is just simply getting cut off, or you might, generate a horizontal bar, which of course as a user is very annoying to deal with. So this is an example of a non-responsive site. Not very usable, not very accessible. So this is an example of why you would want to take into consideration what your site looks like on all devices during the design phase, when you're designing it in Photoshop or maybe on a piece of paper or however you're designing it. And you need to take this into consideration when you're coding. So you either start with the mobile first, build all your CSS for that, and then go in and add your media queries for tablet and for desktop, or you can do it the other way around. Start with the desktop view, make sure that's good, and then go in and add your media queries where needed. It might not be for everything, just where needed, so that everything looks good at tablet width and phone width. Okay, so those are media queries. The first step in allowing you to create websites that are fully usable and accessible on all devices. So media queries are the thing that allow you to create responsive websites. I think that's it. There's my dog again, if you can see her. She's being very vigilant. I think a UPS person is coming soon, so I'm glad they didn't come during this video. All right, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.